Mr. Warren's Profession by Sebastian Nothwell. Chapter 1. Manchester, England, 1891.
Warren? What the devil are you doing here at this hour?
The voice, though gentle, interrupted the distant drone of the factory like a thunderclap. Aubrey Warren snapped to attention. His pen slashed a line through a column in his ledger as he whipped his head up to regard the man in the doorway. The hallway outside the office remained dark despite the weak sunrise fighting its way through the Manchester smog. Yet Aubrey recognized the barrel-shaped body perched on spindly legs as Mr. Jennings, mill manager.
Sorry, sir,
said Aubrey. His broken nib dripped ink between the pages of the ledger. Aubrey whipped out an old rag, already more ink than cloth, to blot the mess. Mr. Jennings shut the office door and hung up his hat, exposing his balding pate.
What time did you come in?
He said, approaching Aubrey's desk.
5 o'clock? 4?
Aubrey held his tongue. Mr. Jennings sighed.
You never went home, did you, Warren?
There was work to be done, sir.
Work ought to be done during office hours.
Mr. Jennings clapped his hands behind his back and bent at the waist to peer down at Aubrey's desk.
That's Smith's ledger, isn't it? Why are you working through the night in another man's ledger, Warren? Sabotage, perhaps? Should I fear mutiny?
From any other man, the stream of questions would be an inquisition. But hearing them in Mr. Jennings's resigned tone, Aubrey didn't feel attacked, only duly chastised.
No, sir. Then Smith has begged you to correct his work for him.
Not so much begged as commanded, Aubrey thought. Aloud he said,
Smith's work is perfectly adequate, sir. Then why are you here? To confirm its adequacy.
Mr. Jennings didn't bother to pretend he believed him.
I'd send you home, Warren, but I'm afraid I cannot spare you today.
Aubrey awaited further explanation. Mr. Jennings offered up nothing more, merely ambled away behind the door of his own inner office, set apart from the common clerks. Aubrey returned to Smith's ledger. Smith himself strolled in at 8:15. While not a notably athletic specimen, he looked like Hercules next to Aubrey. Aubrey's flat, dark hair was a mere shadow of the light brown locks Smith waxed into waves. Smith's bright copper eyes far outshone the black-brown of Aubrey's, and Smith's cheeks flushed warm and pink with life, while Aubrey's sunk into a colour indistinguishable from the parchment he worked on. Though they were of a like age, only Smith carried the aura of youthful vitality. Aubrey, meanwhile, seemed to have died at 20 or so, and somehow kept on with the bookkeeping. Aubrey cast his own attention back down to his desk, and tried to ignore the sounds of Smith tossing his hat and jacket onto their respective pegs. The sound of Smith's footsteps coming closer proved difficult to disregard. The sound of Smith's voice, impossible.
What? Still at it, Warren?
Smith clapped a hand onto Aubrey's shoulder. Aubrey watched in vain as the tail end of his 7 veered off into the next row. He lifted his eyes from the ruined page. So it would seem. Smith clucked his tongue in mock reproof, and much to Aubrey's relief wandered off to his own desk, seeming content to let his ledger remain in Aubrey's more capable hands. Aubrey knew better than to attempt to return it to him. Left up to Smith, the entire mill complex would crumble around their ears. No sooner had Smith sat down than Mr. Jennings reappeared.
Interesting news, boys,
he said. Aubrey snapped to attention. Smith deigned to remove his feet from his desk. Mr. Jennings fixed the same placid look on both.
The mill is changing hands, he continued. Our new owner, Mr. Althorp, requests a tour of the property. Today.
Short notice, yes, but Mr. Jennings ran a tight ship. Whoever this Mr. Althorp was, he would find no fault in the Rook Mill. Not if Aubrey had any say in the matter.
We've an hour and 3/4 to prepare, Mr. Jennings went on. Make yourselves ready.
Lindsey Althorp boarded the morning train from Wiltshire to Manchester. One short tour of the textile mill to show his father he'd grown into sedate and responsible manhood, university or no university. Then he could catch the very next train back to the country house and get on with the urgent business of reading the latest Strand. He would have brought the magazine with him, but reading on the train made him ill. Even without it, he had plenty to occupy his mind. He'd never owned a mill before, which lent a novel air to the day's excursion. His elder sister, Rowena, had predicted over breakfast he'd grow bored with it before the week was out. Because of this, she had not been invited along. He won the mill off Clarence in a card game down at the club last week. He'd had every intention of giving Clarence the chance to win it back, but Clarence had declined all invitations to play. 7 days later, Lindsey supposed it was his to keep. Lindsey had never visited Manchester before. He knew people there, or rather, he knew people who did business there or who hired people to do business there for them. But the city itself, boasting no literary significance or sporting society, at least none Lindsey had ever heard of, did not play to his interests. So Manchester had remained a dull, smoggy haze in his imagination. But as he stepped off the train in Manchester Central, the dull haze sprang to life with a clang that knocked Lindsey's preconceptions right out of his head. Manchester wasn't so downtrodden and depressed as Dickens and Gaskell had led him to believe. The streets surged with crowds to match any in London. The air rang with a constant echo of rattling steam engines and screaming factory whistles. The smog of 1,000 busy chimneys swirled around the hansom cab carrying Lindsey from the train station to his new mill. It would take more than a good brushing to clean the grime of Manchester from Lindsey's blue frock coat, but that was his valet's problem. Rather than concern himself with it, he sat back in idle contentment to watch the industrious world go by. The hansom stopped in front of the largest building. Lindsey stepped down into the courtyard and encountered a bizarre phenomenon. The cobblestones vibrated. He took an experimental step forward. The vibration continued. Lindsey suspected it might bear some relation to the faint roar coming from behind the tall, black rectangular double doors of the mill. He looked up at these doors just as the one on the left opened, allowing more of the roar to escape. A voice projected over the rumbling. "Mr. Althorp?" Lindsey stepped closer. 2 men stood in the doorway. The one who'd spoken looked the same age as Lindsey's father, dressed in a grey suit which matched his grizzled mutton chops. His round bulk kept the second, smaller man in shadow. "You have the advantage of me," said Lindsey, sweeping his top hat from his head. "Mr. Jennings, sir," the grey man said with a deferential nod. "Mill manager." "A pleasure," said Lindsey, not entirely sincere. From architecture to staff, this adventure was proving underwhelming. If Mr. Jennings noticed, he disguised it well. "My assistant clerk," Mr. Jennings said, moving aside to let the other man into Lindsey's line of vision. "Mr. Warren." Lindsey stared. Mr. Warren, appearing scarcely older than Lindsey himself, stood a good head shorter. His heart-shaped face held a small, sharp nose, Cupid's bow lips, and a spellbinding pair of large, dark, half-lidded eyes. He wore a black wool suit which offset the china white of his skin as much as it matched the ebony gleam of his hair, combed back to reveal a high, intelligent forehead. "Sir," said Mr. Warren in a tone as mechanical as their surroundings. He gave Lindsey a clockwork sharp nod. Lindsey hardly heard him, though his hind brain noted the gesture and may have responded in kind. Alternatively, he might have continued staring at Mr. Warren with parted lips and furrowed brow. He couldn't say for certain. "Mr. Althorp?" said Mr. Jennings. "Yes," Lindsey replied, a half-second before he redirected his gaze away from Mr. Warren. "If I may," said Mr. Jennings, standing back with an invitational gesture. Mr. Warren mirrored him in silence. Lindsey stepped up into the mill, and the tour began. From outside, the ground had vibrated. Inside, the floorboards quaked with tenfold violence. The muffled roar multiplied into the endless thundering bellow of Leviathan rumbling through the deep. It deafened Lindsey. He hoped the effect was temporary. The mill interior loomed larger than any ballroom he'd ever danced in. Clattering machines filled it from wall to wall. Lindsey couldn't tell where one ended and another began. To his eyes, it seemed an Ouroboros of cotton and steel. Levers and wheels zipped back and forth, and 1,000 criss-crossed threads trembled in the air. Every motion in the mill produced a fresh burst of lint. This lint floated through the room like a flurry of snowflakes. Lindsey inhaled a speck of it, quite by accident, and coughed. He couldn't hear his cough, could barely feel it reverberate through his own ribcage over the clamour of the room. Dozens of women and girls tended the mechanical labyrinth, reaching in with narrow arms and small hands to adjust this or that, then retreating fractions of a second before steel came crashing down where their limbs had been. These constant brushes with disfigurement, or worse, didn't seem to alarm them. Lindsey turned to Mr. Jennings to remark upon this, but found him already in the midst of speech, crisply gesticulating at various points of interest throughout the room. For all Lindsey could hear him, he may as well have merely mouthed his words. "Pardon?" Lindsey half shouted. Then, realizing half measures would get him nowhere, he repeated his inquiry at a bellow. Neither attracted Mr. Jennings's attention. Before Lindsey lowered himself to tapping Mr. Jennings's shoulder like an impertinent schoolboy, Mr. Warren's pale fingers reached out and performed the service for him. Mr. Jennings gave a start and followed Mr. Warren's nod to Lindsey. Mr. Jennings said a word. Given the context and the shape his mouth formed, Lindsey determined it to be, "Sir?" Lindsey repeated his question. To his amazement, Mr. Jennings heard him and rattled off an answer. Lindsey couldn't hear a word. Still, he nodded as though he understood. Mr. Jennings started down an aisle of the labyrinth. Lindsey looked to Mr. Warren for a cue, and for the simple pleasure of looking at Mr. Warren. Mr. Warren remained stone-faced. No, marble-faced, Lindsey decided, like Michelangelo's David, as he waved Lindsey onward. Lindsey followed Mr. Jennings. Mr. Warren took up the rear, much to Lindsey's consternation. Mr. Jennings attempted to draw Lindsey's attention to various points of interest, shouting over the constant rattle. Lindsey caught none of it. He considered turning to Mr. Warren again under the pretense of asking for clarification, but then Mr. Jennings wanted to show him the winding threads and the rolling wheels and 100 other dreary things that weren't Mr. Warren's face. Mr. Warren remained behind him, or so Lindsey assumed. He dearly wished to turn around and confirm it, but Mr. Jennings pointed to the rotating shafts and belts suspended from the ceiling, forcing Lindsey to tilt his head up and behold them. Like Orpheus and Eurydice, Lindsey thought, his eyes still fixed on the ceiling. Forbidden from gazing upon Mr. Warren, he could only trust Mr. Warren, yet followed him. He wondered if Mr. Warren would find the parallels as amusing as he did. Likely Mr. Jennings would not. He didn't seem the poetic sort. But Mr. Warren was undoubtedly poetic. Surely a marvellous literary mind philosophized underneath his ivory brow. Multitudes of mythological references must teem behind those shadowed eyes, and his mysterious silence. Why, he was clearly deep in thought, as far beyond the earthly realm of the mill as Lindsey himself. This state of affairs continued up all 4 floors of the mill, down the steel spiral staircase, and out the same doors they had entered hours earlier. Lindsey's whole skull rang in the absence of the industrial roar. He turned back to the mill, and much to his relief found Mr. Warren standing there, with Mr. Jennings beside him. "Have you any further inquiry, sir?" said Mr. Jennings. At last, an opportunity to break Mr. Warren's silence. Lindsey would have delighted to hear, in the relative quiet of the yard, the sound of whatever voice might issue from Mr. Warren's beautiful bow-shaped lips. "How many persons does the mill employ?" asked Lindsey, his attention fixed on Mr. Warren's perfect yet immobile face. But Mr. Warren's shadowed eyes flicked away to meet Mr. Jennings, and it was the latter who replied. 166 at present, sir." Lindsey made a second attempt. "And when was the factory complex built?" 1844, sir." Mr. Jennings again. Lindsey racked his brains for a question which Mr. Warren could answer, but Mr. Jennings could not. At length, his mind produced a suitably subtle solution. He withheld a triumphant grin and asked, "How long have you been employed here, Mr. Jennings?" "Some 26 years, sir." Lindsey hummed thoughtfully, then offered up the pièce de résistance of his cunning plan. "And you, Mr. Warren?" Mr. Warren's dark eyes widened. He looked to Mr. Jennings, who raised his eyebrows. Mr. Warren's expression flattened again. He turned back to Lindsey. 8 years, sir," he said. Lindsey ruminated on this new information. He supposed the earliest a lad could start clerking in a textile mill would be 15. Add 8 to that, and Mr. Warren was at least 23, to Lindsey's 21. What he might do with this information, Lindsey couldn't say, but it was more of Mr. Warren than he'd known 5 minutes ago, so he cherished it. "Was there anything else you wanted, sir?" said Mr. Jennings. An excellent question. From Mr. Jennings, nothing. From Mr. Warren, everything. However, the 2 men had one thing in common. "May I see your offices?" asked Mr. Lindsey. After a good 3 seconds' pause, Mr. Jennings replied, "The offices, sir?" "Yes," said Lindsey. "I presume you and Mr. Warren clerk in an office?" "Of course, sir," said Mr. Jennings. "Warren?" Mr. Warren nodded briskly and dashed off. the precise opposite of the outcome Lindsey had hoped for.
"If you'll follow me, sir,"
said Mr. Jennings. Lindsey did his best to disguise his crushing disappointment. The new owner was insane. This was the conclusion Aubrey drew as he sprinted across the yard. Mr. Jennings, ambling along on his twiggy legs, would slow Mr. Althorp down, but even so, Aubrey estimated he had mere minutes to get the mill office in order. He threw the door open and faced his first obstacle. Smith, still at his desk, still asleep. Aubrey stopped in the doorway. The sound of the door alone ought to have woken him, and yet here they were. "Smith," said Aubrey. Smith snored. Aubrey didn't have time for this. "Smith!" he said again, louder. Smith smacked his lips. Aubrey dared not shout. Mr. Althorp might arrive any moment now, and it wouldn't do for him to overhear Aubrey berating his fellow clerk. He considered chucking the apparently comatose Smith out the window, but that was mere fancy. Smith's broad shoulders would never fit through the window frame. Besides, Aubrey didn't think he could lift him. Smith mumbled something in his sleep. Aubrey looked over the office for a solution and came across a crumpled paper ball by Smith's wastebasket. Having missed the bin, it flew a truer course to Smith's forehead. Smith startled awake. "What?" "Mr. Althorp is here," said Aubrey. "Already?" Smith rubbed his face and looked to the clock over the door. "Yes," said Aubrey. "He wishes to see the office. Mr. Jennings is leading him here as we speak." "Oh, splendid," said Smith mildly. Aubrey didn't reply, being far too busy emptying the wastepaper bins into the corner stove, where yesterday's coals still smouldered. The papers flared up. An ember landed on Aubrey's thigh. He hurried to pat it out and brush it away, muttering oaths under his breath. A cursory examination showed minimal damage to his trousers. The ember hadn't stayed long enough to burn, and the black wool helped disguise charcoal smears. Still, Aubrey knew the blemish existed, and the knowledge had already begun driving him mad. Smith wasn't helping. "So," said Smith, who remained seated at his desk, though he had finally put his heels back on the floor where they belonged. "What's Althorp like, then?" Based on first impressions, Aubrey had determined several facts regarding Mr. Althorp. First, he was young, much younger than Aubrey had expected, though according to rumour the previous owner, Mr. Rook, was of a like age. Mr. Althorp was also aristocratic, judging by his crisp public school accent and the long aquiline features that seemed to come standard with a peerage. Such a lineage might explain his peculiar mannerisms, the staring, the selective hearing loss, the general air of sleepwalking. "Warren!" said Smith. "Are you deaf?" "Tall," said Aubrey. "What?" "He's quite tall," Aubrey elaborated. In fact, he thought Mr. Althorp bore strong resemblance to a lamp-post. A tall, narrow pole topped with bright blonde curls like a yellow gas flame. "That's all you know?" Aubrey opened his mouth to retort. A muffled voice outside the office cut him off. He rushed to the door. In that instant, the door swung inward. Aubrey scampered out of the way to admit Mr. Jennings, who held the door open for Mr. Althorp.